Have you ever wondered what secret could be worth more than $120 billion? What if I told you that the richest man on earth chose not to leave his fortune to his children, not to his closest friends, not even to the executives who helped build his empire, but to an elderly janitor who spent decades quietly cleaning the company's floors? Stay with me until the very end, because this incredible story of loyalty, sacrifice, betrayal, and redemption will reveal a truth no one saw coming. Victor Harrington stood silently before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his luxurious penthouse, watching the first rays of sunlight paint the city in gold. Below him stretched the skyline of a metropolis that had become a symbol of his extraordinary success. Newspapers called him the greatest businessman of his generation. Television hosts praised his brilliance. Millions admired him, believing that money had given him everything a person could ever want. But they were wrong. Behind the wealth, the private jets, the towering skyscrapers, and the global empire was a burden he had carried for 35 long years. It was a secret buried so deeply that only one other person in the entire world knew it. Victor slowly closed his eyes and whispered, "The truth deserves to be free." He had already signed the documents that would shock the entire world. Only a few hours later, every major television station interrupted its regular programming. Breaking news alerts lit up millions of phones around the world. The world's richest billionaire, Victor Harrington, has died peacefully at the age of 78. Outside Harrington Global headquarters, reporters rushed into position. News helicopters circled overhead, while thousands gathered behind security barriers. Investors, employees, and curious citizens all asked the same question: who would inherit the greatest fortune in history? Inside the company's headquarters, employees stood silently in the marble lobby. Some lowered their heads in respect. Others quietly wiped away tears. But while the world mourned Victor Harrington's death, a sealed envelope rested on a polished oak table inside the executive conference room. That envelope contained a decision powerful enough to destroy families, expose hidden lies, and change history forever. The story everyone believed had ended was only just beginning. As luxury cars began arriving outside the headquarters, the billionaire's family stepped out one by one. His eldest son, Richard Harrington, wore an expensive black suit and carried himself with complete confidence. His daughter, Victoria, barely spoke as she walked through the crowd of photographers. Close behind them came business partners, lawyers, distant relatives, and powerful investors. Every one of them believed they already knew how this day would end. For decades they had lived in Victor Harrington's shadow, waiting for the moment when his unimaginable fortune would finally become theirs. Some were already discussing how they would divide the companies. Others quietly planned new business deals worth billions. Not one of them noticed an elderly man quietly pushing a cleaning cart through the front entrance. That man was Samuel Brooks. Within the next hour, his name would become known around the world. Samuel Brooks had worked at Harrington Global for 42 years, long before the glass skyscrapers, long before the private jets, long before the company became a global empire. Samuel had already been there. Every morning he arrived before sunrise. Every evening he was the last to leave. He knew every hallway, every office, and almost every employee by name. Yet most people barely noticed him. To executives, he was simply the janitor. Few realized that Victor Harrington greeted Samuel by name every single morning. Even fewer knew the two men shared a bond that stretched back more than 3 decades. A bond built on one unforgettable night. A night neither of them had ever spoken about in public. At exactly 10 o'clock that morning, The doors to the executive conference hall slowly opened. One by one, the guests entered. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. The billionaire's family took their seats in the front row. Behind them sat board members, senior executives, company lawyers, and financial advisors. No one spoke above a whisper. At the center of the room stood a long, polished table. Resting on it was a single sealed envelope bearing Victor Harrington's signature. Beside it stood his trusted attorney, who had served him faithfully for more than 30 years. He adjusted his glasses, looked around the silent room, and took a deep breath. No one realized that the next sentence spoken inside that hall would become one of the most shocking moments in business history. The lawyer slowly reached for the envelope. The lawyer carefully picked up the sealed envelope. For a brief moment, he simply stared at Victor Harrington's signature. It was the last document the billionaire had ever signed. The room became so quiet that the ticking of the antique clock on the wall seemed louder than ever before. Every pair of eyes followed the lawyer's trembling hands as he slowly broke the wax seal. No one dared to speak. Richard Harrington sat confidently, already imagining himself as the new head of the family empire. Victoria folded her hands and smiled faintly, convinced that her father had surely prepared something special for his children. Across the room, Samuel Brooks remained standing quietly near the back, hoping the ceremony would end quickly so he could return to work. He never imagined his life was about to change forever. The lawyer unfolded the document, adjusted his glasses, and took a deep breath. Then he began to read. "My name is Victor Harrington." The lawyer's voice echoed across the conference hall. "If you are hearing these words, it means my journey has come to an end." The room remained silent. "My family, my friends, and everyone gathered here. Thank you for sharing my life." Several relatives nodded respectfully. Then came the sentence no one expected. "I leave my entire estate, every company, every investment, every building, every private jet, every dollar." The lawyer paused. The silence became unbearable. "To Samuel Brooks." For several seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. Even Samuel looked around, convinced there had been some terrible mistake. The silence shattered instantly. "That's impossible!" Richard leapt from his chair. Victoria slammed both hands onto the table. Several executives stood, shouting over one another. "This will is fake! Call the judge! There must be another version!" Security rushed toward the front of the room as reporters outside noticed the commotion through the glass walls. Samuel stood frozen, gripping his old cleaning cart with trembling hands. He had spent 42 years cleaning the company's floors. Never once had he asked Victor Harrington for money. Never once had he expected recognition. Yet somehow, the richest man in the world had left everything to him. The lawyer slowly raised his hand. "Please." His calm voice gradually silenced the room. "There is one more page." The shouting stopped. Everyone returned to their seats. The lawyer opened the second document. Victor Harrington had added one final condition. Samuel Brooks would receive every penny of the inheritance, only if he publicly revealed the truth about what happened 35 years ago. A chill swept through the conference hall. Samuel's face turned pale. His hands began to shake, because he knew exactly what Victor was talking about, and he had spent 35 years praying that day would never come. Samuel slowly lowered his head. Tears filled his tired eyes. The conference hall around him seemed to disappear as painful memories flooded back. Rain, smoke, fire, screams, a promise made in the darkness. 35 years earlier, Victor Harrington had not been the richest billionaire in the world. He had been a desperate businessman, on the edge of losing everything. And Samuel was just a young janitor trying to earn an honest living. Neither of them knew that one terrible night would bind their lives together forever. The secret buried for 3.5 decades was finally ready to be uncovered. 35 years earlier, long before Victor Harrington became the richest billionaire in the world, before the skyscrapers, before the private jets, before anyone knew his name, he owned nothing more than a struggling steel factory on the edge of bankruptcy. The factory was old, the machines were worn out, and every passing week pushed the company closer to collapse. Banks refused to lend him more money. Investors had walked away. His workers whispered that the factory would close before the end of the month, but Victor refused to give up. Every morning before sunrise, he unlocked the factory gates himself. Every night he stayed long after the workers had gone home, searching for one idea that could save everything. He believed success was only one breakthrough away. He had no idea that fate was preparing a very different future. Among the newest employees was a quiet young man named Samuel Brooks. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a manager. He wasn't even a factory worker. He was the night janitor. Every evening, after everyone else had gone home, Samuel pushed his old cleaning cart through the empty hallways, polishing floors, cleaning offices, and collecting forgotten tools. Most people never noticed him, but Samuel noticed everything. He saw exhausted workers hiding their worries. He saw broken machines held together with temporary repairs. And every single night, he saw Victor working alone, refusing to abandon his dream. Samuel admired the man's determination. Little did he know, their lives were about to become connected forever. Near midnight, Victor decided to test a newly repaired production machine. The equipment had been giving problems for weeks. Engineers had warned that it wasn't completely safe, but Victor believed one successful test could save the company from bankruptcy. He switched on the machine. At first, everything seemed normal. The belts began turning. The motors hummed to life. Then came a strange, metallic sound. A loud spark burst from the control panel. Victor froze. Something was terribly wrong. Without warning, a deafening explosion shook the entire factory. Windows shattered into thousands of pieces. Flames raced across the production floor. Black smoke filled the air within seconds. The emergency alarm screamed through every hallway. Workers who had stayed behind ran desperately toward the exits. Victor was knocked to the ground by the blast. His ears rang as pieces of steel crashed around him. Then he heard someone shouting through the smoke. "There's still a man trapped inside." Most people ran away from the fire, but Samuel Brooks did the exact opposite. Without hesitation, he threw down his cleaning equipment, covered his face with his jacket, and sprinted straight into the burning factory. That single decision would become the secret that remained hidden for the next 35 years, and the reason a billionaire would one day leave $120 billion to a janitor. The heat was unbearable. Thick black smoke swallowed every hallway, making it almost impossible to see. Flames climbed the walls as pieces of burning metal crashed onto the factory floor. Every instinct told Samuel to turn back, but he kept moving forward. Somewhere inside, someone was still alive. Holding his breath, he shouted into the darkness, "Can anyone hear me?" For a few terrifying seconds, there was only silence. Then, a faint cry echoed through the smoke. Samuel knew exactly where to go, hidden beneath a collapsed steel beam. Victor Harrington struggled to breathe. His leg was trapped. The fire was spreading closer every second. He had already accepted that he wasn't getting out alive. Then, through the smoke, he saw a shadow running toward him. It was Samuel. Without hesitation, Samuel grabbed the heavy steel beam with both hands. Ignoring the pain in his burning hands, he lifted with everything he had. The beam shifted just enough. Victor was free, but their escape had only just begun. Supporting Victor over his shoulder, Samuel guided him through the burning factory. The roof groaned above them. Every step felt like their last. As they reached the exit, Victor stopped. He looked Samuel in the eyes. "You didn't just save my life. You saved my family's future." Samuel simply smiled. Anyone would have done the same. Victor slowly shook his head. No, they wouldn't. Those words would stay with him for the next 35 years, unknown to both men. Someone else had been watching everything. From behind a stack of storage crates, a young accountant witnessed the entire rescue. He also saw something else. Just moments before the explosion, one senior executive had secretly tampered with the factory's electrical controls. It wasn't an accident. It was sabotage. Terrified for his life, the accountant buried the truth, and for 35 years, he never spoke a single word. Voiceover. By morning, the newspapers called it a tragic industrial accident. Insurance investigators closed the case. The factory was rebuilt. Victor became one of the richest businessmen in the world. Samuel quietly returned to his janitor's job, never asking for recognition, never telling anyone what really happened that night. But Victor never forgot. Deep inside his private safe, he kept one handwritten letter. It contained a promise that could only be fulfilled 35 years later. To be continued. Years passed. The factory grew into one of the most successful companies in the world. Victor Harrington became a billionaire, admired across the globe. People praised his intelligence. They celebrated his business victories. But no one knew. Every year, on the anniversary of the factory fire, Victor quietly returned to the old building. He would stand in silence, looking at the place where Samuel had risked everything to save him. He never forgot the debt he could never repay without telling anyone. Victor ordered his private security team to keep an eye on Samuel, not to spy on him, but to protect him. The reports always said the same thing. Samuel lived in a small apartment. He donated part of his salary to struggling families. He helped children pay their school fees. He never accepted praise. He never asked for money. His kindness remained invisible to the world. But Victor saw everything, and every report strengthened the decision he had already made. Victor's children believed the company belonged to them. At family dinners, they argued over luxury cars, private islands, and who would become the next CEO. None of them asked about the workers. None of them cared about the people who had built the company. Victor listened in silence. Deep inside, he realized that wealth could be inherited, but character could not. That painful truth changed the future forever. Late one evening, Victor invited his personal lawyer to his private office. He placed a single envelope on the desk. Inside were old photographs, medical reports, a newspaper clipping from the factory fire, and one handwritten letter. "When I am gone," Victor said quietly, "read this will exactly as I wrote it." The lawyer looked confused. "Sir, your family will never accept this." Victor nodded. "I know. That's why the truth must finally be revealed." Weeks later, the world awoke to shocking headlines. Billionaire Victor Harrington dies at 78. Business leaders flew in from around the world. His family gathered inside the company's grand boardroom. No one noticed the elderly janitor quietly mopping the hallway outside. Samuel believed it would be just another ordinary day at work. He had no idea that in a few minutes, the lawyer would call his name, and the greatest inheritance in history would begin with one impossible question. Samuel Brooks, can you tell us what really happened 35 years ago? The boardroom fell completely silent. The lawyer slowly adjusted his glasses, opened the final page of Victor Harrington's will, and spoke the words no one expected. To Samuel Brooks. The elderly janitor looked up in confusion. I leave my entire estate, valued at $120 billion. For several seconds, no one moved. Then the room exploded. That's impossible. He's just a janitor. This has to be fraud. Victor's children jumped to their feet, demanding answers, but the lawyer calmly raised his hand. There is one final condition. The lawyer unfolded one final letter. His voice echoed across the room. Samuel Brooks will receive every dollar, only if he tells the complete truth about the factory fire 35 years ago. Every eye turned toward Samuel. His hands began to tremble. For 35 years, he had buried the truth deep inside his heart. He had promised never to speak of that night. Now, the future of a billion-dollar empire depended on his words. Samuel slowly removed his old work cap, his eyes filled with tears. I never wanted this money, he whispered. I only wanted Mr. Harrington to live. The room became silent once again. Then Samuel looked toward Victor's children. There is something your father never wanted you to know. The lawyer quietly nodded. The moment had finally arrived. Samuel took a deep breath. The factory fire, he began, was never an accident. Gasps filled the boardroom. Business executives looked at one another in disbelief. Victor's eldest son slammed his hand onto the table. What are you talking about? Samuel closed his eyes. Someone inside this company caused that explosion on purpose. The room froze. Samuel reached into his worn jacket. Slowly, he pulled out a faded envelope. Inside was a photograph and a handwritten confession Victor had asked him to protect. Your father discovered who sabotaged the factory, Samuel said quietly. He chose not to expose the truth immediately because innocent families would have suffered. The lawyer carefully accepted the envelope. As he opened it, one member of the Harrington family suddenly turned pale. They knew exactly what was inside. The empire's greatest secret was finally about to be revealed. The lawyer carefully unfolded the faded letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to Victor Harrington. He began reading aloud. If you are hearing these words, it means I am no longer alive. The room fell silent. 35 years ago, I discovered that the factory fire was not an accident. Every heartbeat in the room seemed louder than the lawyer's voice. The person responsible was someone I trusted more than anyone else. A wave of disbelief swept across the boardroom. The lawyer turned to the next page. Victor had written one name, a former senior executive, Richard Collins. Years before the fire, Richard had secretly planned to destroy the factory. He wanted investors to panic, so he could buy the struggling company for almost nothing. But his plan failed. Victor survived, and the company became one of the greatest business empires in history. Richard disappeared before anyone could expose him, or so everyone believed. Just as the lawyer finished reading, the boardroom doors slowly opened. An elderly man entered with the help of a walking stick. Samuel immediately recognized him. It was the accountant who had witnessed the sabotage 35 years earlier. He had remained silent all these years, living in fear. But today, He was finally ready to tell the truth. The elderly accountant placed a dusty metal box on the conference table. Inside were old factory blueprints, maintenance reports, photographs, and one small cassette tape. "I've protected these for 35 years, he said. "Victor told me to reveal them only when the time was right." The lawyer inserted the cassette into an old recorder. A familiar voice filled the room. It was Richard Collins, confessing everything. Shock spread across the boardroom. Victor's children could hardly believe what they had heard. The executives sat frozen. Samuel quietly lowered his head. He had carried this burden for more than 3 decades. Now, the truth had finally been set free. But Victor's final plan was not over. The greatest surprise was still waiting inside the last sealed envelope. The lawyer reached for the last envelope on the table. Unlike the others, it was sealed with dark red wax. Across the front, Victor had written only 5 words. "Open only after the truth." Everyone held their breath. The lawyer carefully broke the seal. Inside was another handwritten letter and a small silver key. No one knew what the key unlocked, but everyone knew. Victor had planned one final surprise. The silver key led the lawyer, Samuel, and the family deep beneath the company's headquarters, behind an old steel door, hidden for decades, was a private vault that almost no one knew existed. As the heavy door slowly opened, rows of dusty boxes came into view. Every box carried the same label: truth. Victor had spent years collecting evidence, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. At the center of the vault stood a large television. Beside it, a video player. The lawyer inserted an old memory drive. The screen flickered to life. Victor Harrington appeared. Older, weaker, but smiling. "If you are watching this," he said, "then Samuel has kept his promise." Tears filled Samuel's eyes. He hadn't heard Victor's voice since the day he died. Victor looked directly into the camera. "Money never made me the richest man. The man who carried my secret, protected my family, and never asked for anything in return." He paused. "That man is richer than I ever was." The room became silent. Even Victor's children lowered their heads in shame. For the first time, they understood what their father had valued most. Victor smiled one last time. "Samuel, if you are hearing this, everything I built now belongs to you. Not because you saved my life, but because you proved that honesty, loyalty, and kindness are worth more than billions." Samuel could no longer hold back his tears. Around him, the room stood in complete silence. The inheritance had never been about money. It had always been about finding the one person worthy enough to protect a legacy. Victor's image slowly faded from the screen, but before it disappeared completely, he spoke one final sentence. "Don't build statues in my name. Build opportunities for people who have been forgotten." Samuel wiped the tears from his face. He finally understood why Victor had trusted him. The inheritance wasn't meant to create another billionaire. It was meant to create hope. Days later, news spread around the world. Samuel Brooks, the humble janitor, had officially become the owner of Harrington Industries. Journalists crowded outside the company's headquarters. Everyone expected luxury cars, private jets, and celebrations. Instead, Samuel arrived wearing the same old work boots he had worn for years. The cameras couldn't believe what they were seeing. Samuel stood before thousands of employees. His voice was calm, but every word carried meaning. "No worker will ever lose a job because of greed. No child will go hungry while this company succeeds. And no honest employee will ever be forgotten again." The crowd erupted into applause. Many workers wiped tears from their eyes. For the first time in decades, they believed their future was safe. Within months, scholarship programs were created. Hospitals received funding. Factories became safer. Families who had suffered because of the old factory fire were finally compensated. Samuel never called it charity. He called it keeping a promise. Victor's dream had become something far greater than a business. It had become a legacy of compassion. 1 year later, a young reporter asked Samuel a simple question. How does it feel to become one of the richest men in the world? Samuel smiled gently. Then he looked toward the old factory, where everything had begun. Real wealth isn't measured by money, he said. It's measured by the lives you change when no one is watching. Those words spread across the world, and they became the greatest lesson Victor Harrington ever left behind. The end, or perhaps the beginning of a new legacy. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more inspiring billionaire stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.